There was a well-known gangster who was shot and killed in a housing complex in Johannesburg sometime last year. And if it's not entirely fair to call him a gangster, let's just say he was a guy who hung out with gangs a lot. Anyway, in the press, his family had said of him that he was a person with flaws, but that at heart he was a really, really good guy. And I smiled at that. And I confess, I think my smile was judgmental. Now, parables are not moral stories. They're not fairy tales that are supposed to make some moral point. They, in fact, are pieces of art. They are designed, they are inspired works that Jesus tells that are intended, they're these stories that are intended to make you think, which is why Jesus says at the end of ours and other parables, he says, let anyone with ears listen. In other words, work this stuff out. Think it through. Let it stretch you. Let it blow your mind. And the story we read today is really the story of creation. It's about how God's good seed is sown into God's good soil. And in the parable, it's referred to as wheat. And then into that same soil where the goodness is sown, another comes along and sows another kind of seed that produces weeds. And in our story, that's referred to as evil. And again, in the story, the slaves inquire of the master. They say, should we pull out those weeds as they grow alongside the wheat? And the master replies, no, because in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. So let both of them grow together until the harvest. And that's the thing, hey? Isn't that mind-blowing? Let both of them grow together until the harvest. There's no such thing as a person who is all good or a person who is all evil. We are all a mix of wheat and weeds. In all of us, the wheat and weeds grow together. You know that saying, eh? It's quite popular. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. But I wonder where that popular saying leaves us. I mean, do we all then just muddle along in our imperfections? You know, like, oh, he beats his wife to smithereens when he's drunk, but you know, nobody's perfect. Or he molested his 12-year-old niece. Oh, but you know, like nobody's perfect, eh? Or if you're famous, you can do what you like with a woman. You can grab her by her privates and you can move on her like a bitch. Because you know what they say. And they do say, we've heard people say, oh, come on, man. Oh, nobody's perfect. And that other guy, the one who didn't like the Jews, so he came up with a solution. In fact, he called it, the final solution, it was intended to obliterate all Jewish people off the face of the planet. Oh, but nobody's perfect, eh? We can't live with that. We can't live with that. So what are we to do? We are tempted, or let me at least say I am tempted, to stand on a soapbox, proudly filled with our own sense of goodness, and we stand and we damn all the weeds we see around us in society and in others. But this little story will not let us do that. It will keep telling us that we are both wheat and weeds. But inasmuch as the story won't let us get onto a soapbox, neither will it let us remain silent. All the talk of judgment at the end of this parable is not really about what happens to us when we die. It's there to give us an insight into how God feels, how deeply God feels about evil, about the weeds. And in case you missed it, he is not happy. He's not happy at all about the weeds. So we imperfect people are called to stand up against what is evil. We don't get to do it proudly. We don't get to do it arrogantly. We only ever get to do this with some sense of fear and trembling because we are conscious that we are imperfect people ourselves. But make no mistake, there is a place for imperfect people to say, I am not perfect, but I know, in God's name, I know that what you are doing is wrong. Peter Story, a previous bishop of our church, was a part of a delegation that went to challenge P.W. Botha, a previous president of our country. He went to challenge P.W. Botha about apartheid and some of the issues around it. And Peter tells the story of how P.W.'s retort in the midst of that challenge was to say, well, the church across South Africa also remains substantially divided along racial lines. And so P.W. said, when you guys get your house in order, then I'll listen to you. And Peter acknowledges that that was a difficult challenge to hear. But, we don't get to hide behind other people's wrongdoing, other people's imperfections, and let's even call it other people's evil. We don't get to defend our own because others are doing it. There's no room for that. Imperfect people still need to challenge what is evil, even as they continue to examine their own hearts and recognize their own imperfections. Peter's story goes on to say, if everyone waited to be perfect before calling out evil, then there would just be silence. So for 2,000 years, and this is because the church is also a mix of wheat and weeds, because it's made up of people, I think we've had a habit, and when I say habit, I mean we have consistently done this over the 2,000 years. We've continued to call sometimes what is good sin, and what is sin good. And so we, as the community of faith, the community of Jesus, we are far from perfect in always discerning the difference between wheat and weeds. And so today, I want to suggest just one sound principle on which I think we can all rely, a sound principle upon which we can depend, a sound principle that reflects, I think, God's heart in helping us to know the difference between wheat and weeds. And it's simply this, that those who stand on the side of goodness, those who champion the growth of wheat in our world, those who seek to undermine the flourishing of the weeds that we see around us, they will always be people who listen to and respond to the cries of our world. The champions of wheat, the underminers of weeds, are always people who want to listen to and respond to the cries of our world. Just this past week, the BBC broadcast a report on the appalling state of the hospitals in our own city here in Port Elizabeth. And I was very moved that some of our church leaders in a WhatsApp conversation were wrestling with saying, can our little church community here on the corner of Newton Street and 3rd Avenue, can we do anything to alleviate this immense problem? I loved their hearts. I was grateful that I'm a part of a community of people who want to say, we want to listen, and we want to see if there's some way that we can respond to even these massive issues that are around us. After a funeral the other day, I popped into a shop that I sometimes go to. And in the shop, when I went to the shop, I was still dressed in black and in my dog collar. And one of the guys who works there is a lovely gay guy, and he's usually cheerful and happy and helpful, and he's nice to be around when you walk into the shop. Warm and friendly. But on this particular day, when he saw me, he was quite standoffish. In fact, I thought he was a little rude and even unhelpful. And I wondered, was this like COVID stress or what's going on for the guy? And then it suddenly dawned on me, and I may be wrong, but it suddenly dawned on me, I wonder if it's not my clothing. He'd never seen me dressed like that before, and I wondered maybe these clothes represented for him a group of people who usually condemn him and people like him. I wondered if he made an association with me in that moment of saying he belongs to the group of people who want to send me to hell. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I wondered. Some of the key political movements in our world today, and I really ask you to hear this, but some of these popular key political movements that work in our world today are structured around deliberately ignoring the cries and the pain of our world. That's in fact why they are popular, because they seek to silence the cries of the world. They seek to mute the cries of the world. And the tragedy of that is that the whole Jewish Christian story really begins with one statement that God makes to Moses. It's really the statement that initiates the birth of Israel. When God comes to Moses and says, I have heard the cries of my people. I have heard the cries of my people. And so I appeal to you. I deeply appeal to you to resist any thinking, any politics, any way, any behavior, any manner which deliberately ignores the pain of others. Be very cautious with these things that are around on social media that seek to silence and seek to mute the pain of others. Even if you think it's excessive or biased, be very careful. Be very careful before you mute the pain of others. Because the people of God are like God's nerve endings in our world. We are designed to be sensitive to the pain of the world. We are intended to see what's going on in the world. We are meant to experience it, even when human nature is to deny it. We are intended to turn towards the pain and not away from it. And when we do that, when we allow ourselves to notice and to see and to pay attention, when we do that, we can be confident that we stand on the side of goodness and that we will see clearly the difference between wheat and weeds. I don't know about you, but if on Judgment Day our lives have been found wanting, wouldn't we rather together have found ourselves to have erred on the side of having our arms too wide open, if you like, too welcoming, than to be found to have had hearts that are too hard, arms that are closed, hearts that are unwelcoming. The way Jesus lived and died was with his arms open wide, wide, wide. And when our arms are open wide, when we are attentive, we can be sure that we stand on the side of goodness. That posture gives us eyes to see the wheat and the weeds a little more clearly. So at the end of this parable, when evil is finally conquered once and for all, Jesus says this will happen. The righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And so, my dear fellow imperfect people, along with this Jesus who leads us and guides us, who promises us that one day the righteous will shine, can I encourage you to turn up the light already a bit and shine? For Jesus' sake, shine. And God bless you today. It's been good to have you with us.